Time is tight for many of us. Sometimes money's even tighter. Today I want to share one way that I've increased the caliber of our meals while cutting the cost and my hands-on time in the kitchen at the same time. Today I want to focus on brisket. Now I know sometimes this might seem like a splurge, but in reality, brisket at my local Sam's Club is currently $4.18 per pound. While if I go to Walmart to get 80/20 hamburger, it's $5.93. That means for every single meal that I can substitute brisket over burger in my protein source, that protein comes in 30% cheaper than if I was doing a hamburger. Now, let me tell you, in my house, a well-cooked brisket comes in head and shoulders over a burger every single day of the week. So I want to bring you along and show you not only how I cook the brisket, but what we can make with it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now, the key to a perfectly cooked brisket is nailing the right temperature. For the past 6 months, I've had a wireless meat thermometer on my wish list, and I was even saving my birthday money for it to grab one here coming up soon. As luck would have it, Typhur, today's sponsor, contacted me asking if I would be interested in trying out the Typhur Sync Duo at home. Now, I have to tell you, it didn't take me more than 5 minutes of research to know this is something that I definitely wanted to try. So, what exactly is the Typhur Sync? It's a wireless thermometer that uses Wi-Fi and or Bluetooth to measure the temperature of your meat regardless of where it's cooking, whether that's on the grill, in a smoker, in your own oven, or on the stovetop, which uses 6 points to measure the temperature, the ambient temperature, as well as 5 inside your meat, down to plus or minus zero point 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit for accuracy. Now, if you know anything about cooking meat, you know that this is super critical to know exactly when to take it off, unless, of course, you like that well-done steak, but that's not how we do things around here. The Dual, which is the one I have, comes with 2 rechargeable probes that charge right in the base, which also has the temperature readouts on it in case you aren't so tech friendly or you don't want to have to rely on an app on your phone to know the exact temperature. The screen will show you temperatures for both probe 1 and 2, as well as the ambient temperature where they're cooking. Now today I'm smoking and I have 2 different racks, which both briskets will go on. The one at the top, of course, will be hotter, and that was relayed through the entirety of the cook on the sensor itself. And then the one that is lower, of course, will be slightly cooler. Now, I'm cooking 2 briskets here just for the simple ease of showing you exactly what all we can do with it. I knew if I could just cook one, my kids would want to eat it all, and I wouldn't have anything left to show you how we use the leftovers for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So I have a fattier Wagyu cut on top, and then just a traditional brisket that we get every single year from one of our local friends on the bottom. So that lower one's taking advantage of all of the fat dripping down from that Wagyu. Now, to monitor your cook, all you have to do is make sure to leave this base close to the meat itself. That allows the base to communicate with the 2 probes that are inside the meat, sending all of the data to the app, or of course, you can walk out and check it anytime you want. Now, speaking of the app, it not only gives you all of the temperatures and the cook time and estimated time remaining for each item that you have in there, but it also gives you a ton of recipes that you can use to set up the cook itself. Now, this came in really handy for me because typically I'll do a little research online, find the recipe that I want, and go get started. But all I had to do was open up the Typhur app, click Smoke Brisket, and tell it that I wanted to cook it. You can edit the temperature if you want, or you can just hit start. It'll do all the calculations for you and let you know when it's done. Also gives you the recipe for any spices or seasonings or anything you need to do before you put it in. So for me, that app was super handy. I even laid in bed, putting my little one down for a nap, watching to see when I needed to come out and grab it out. And then again at night, when it was done, I did the same thing. I got everybody in bed. I laid down with them to get them asleep. And then when it was time, jumped up and came out to pick up the brisket. Now, speaking of night, I don't recommend starting to cook a brisket at 11 a.m., but that's what time it happened for us today. So I did finish this up in the middle of the night, but when you do this yourself, make sure to start in the morning. The sink is offered in a dual and a quad. So if you are used to cooking up more meat than me at one time, definitely check out their options. They have an amazing sale going on right now for the Olympics. And if you use code the hometown, all caps at checkout, you'll save an additional 10% on top of those already ridiculously discounted prices. You will find links in the description below, as well as links to any of the recipes that you see me cooking with here today. Now, I pulled these briskets out about midnight. I let them sit on the counter to cool for a couple hours and then came down and slid them into the refrigerator where they were waiting for us the next morning when we woke up. Now, I did promise you breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and that's exactly where we're going to start. So, to kick off our breakfast, I am making a brisket hash. Now, we are obviously overflowing with fresh vegetables right now, so I grabbed a ton of peppers out of the garden recently, as well as some onions and garlic. So that's where this is going to kick off. But to get started, the potatoes were the first thing on my mind because they are still dirty, of course. When they come in out of the ground, I don't wash them off because I want them to last a little bit longer. So I'm giving them a good wash. And the potatoes that I'm using are those tiny little ones that come when the potatoes are first forming and they just didn't have time to fully mature. So I'm using all of the tiny little potatoes from this year's harvest, and then I will only have to just slice them in half simply for speed of cooking and to make sure that they get seasoned well in the middle. Now, traditionally for something like this, you would use your onions and your garlic and then probably some bell peppers. I think the recipe actually called for red and green bell peppers, but we don't have any red and green bell peppers ready to go, or at least I wanted to leave them on the vine a little bit longer so the plant was able to bring them to maturity and give them a little more color. So what I'm using are some banana peppers. We grow banana peppers every year because my kiddos love them canned, so we can use them for sandwiches all year long. And right now, those banana peppers are just going gangbusters. They're always some of the first to mature, and I really love them as something really fresh and a quick snack for the kids. I'm also toying with the idea of overwintering some peppers, even though I'm in Southwest Missouri and they're definitely not going to make it outside. So if you've ever overwintered peppers before, let me know if it's worth my time. With the initial prep all complete, it's time to head on over to the stove and get this cooking up. Let me tell you, it smelled so good that it was better than an alarm clock at the house. The kids slowly started to come downstairs as the smell started drifting up. Although my tiniest helper likes to be carried down, she was not interested in walking down the stairs herself this morning, so I had to take a break and run up and get her while the oil was getting hot. But once she saw that I was actually in the kitchen and cooking, she was ready to get her chair, get in her spot, and see what she could do to help us out. And while she did think this smelled good, she was still asking for waffles. So I'm not exactly sure what I can do to bring her over to my side, that a more protein full breakfast is the way to go, but we're working on it and she's coming around. So first into the pan was the peppers and the onions, and I let them saute for just like a minute or two before I went ahead and grabbed those potatoes to put them in. Now, if you already have potatoes prepped from the night before, say you were having brisket and potatoes and you had some leftovers, that makes this a whole lot faster because you don't have to wait for those potatoes to cook. But if you're like me and using fresh, make sure to start with the smaller pieces cut up so you can get them cooking in a relatively short amount of time. Now, while that was over on the stove, I went ahead and grabbed out the larger of the two briskets. You will notice there are not two here, and that's because I didn't cook breakfast, lunch, and dinner in order. So breakfast was actually the last meal that I prepared for this specific piece of content. So that's why you're only seeing one on the board, but I couldn't bring myself to let my OCD down and show it to you in any other way than the way it would actually come out in a normal day. With this being the third meal for my brisket, we did finish the smaller brisket before we got to this meal. But that wasn't specifically from meals itself. One of my kiddos likes to just snack on it throughout the day. So that kind of became his snack over this week. And he took a little more of it than I would have let him have if budget was a big concern. So I just want you to know you can get multiple meals out of one brisket, specifically if you cut back slightly on the amount called for in a recipe. The recipe that I used for the brisket hash called for 2 cups of chopped brisket, but you could easily go down to 1 cup and still have an amazing meal if you wanted to add a couple more eggs at the end instead of focusing so heavily on the brisket for your protein. Additionally, if your family doesn't want to eat brisket for multiple times in 1 week, this is still an amazing thing to do to save money. Brisket freezes and reheats very, very well. We have done this for years where my husband will smoke a bunch of brisket for a family event and then we'll freeze it for a month or so later when we're going to have another large party. So don't hesitate to freeze something like a brisket, and then you can freeze it all chopped up in 2 cup servings if you like, or whatever serving size works best for your family. And then just pull it out when you need that specific meal. In the past, I have also canned brisket and keep it on my shelf. I love that for a very, very fast, simple, and easy meal just from the beginning. But if you're not into canning, just tossing it in the freezer already cooked is a really great way to go. The hash turned out great. It actually was something that my husband grabbed the minute he got home from work on this specific day and finished off what was left. Those large chunks of brisket fat in there melted beautifully and just added an amazing flavor. So if you ever have some leftover brisket or you're looking to change up your breakfast, don't sleep on adding brisket in because it really was an additional amazing flavor to what we were making. Now, the next meal is going to be lunch. And this is something that we do often when we have leftover brisket. This is what you think of as like a traditional leftover meal. Instead of just having slices of brisket like you normally would the first time you have the meal, we're going to go ahead and throw it on some buns, get them toasted up, and have a really delicious brisket sandwich. The easiest way to do this when you're starting from cold is just to slice off the slices that you're going to need. We took maybe, I don't know, 10 slices or so here, and then put them on a tray and slid them over in the air fryer on reheat for about 4 minutes. And it came out absolutely perfect. There definitely is no need to slow roll the process of using a leftover or a brisket cooked up and saved for this specific purpose by reheating the entire thing. So definitely just slice off whatever you need. Or if somebody wants to eat it cold, like my little guy, I keep those extra slices handy because heating the entire thing will not only dry it out faster, but will also make your meal prep take a way longer amount of time. And right now, my goal was definitely not to slow things down on this specific day. I had lunch going, then we had to go to the pool. I went to my monthly Azure pickup, which is about 30 minutes away, and then back to get another meal ready before the kids went off to Bible school. So this was one of those days where having something halfway prepped was definitely a big hit for us. And the exact reason that I like to cook up meat in bulk, whether it is brisket or a bunch of chicken thighs or whatever the protein source might be, if we can do a big cook like this over the weekend, it really helps the entire week flow a whole lot faster. Now I'm toasting up the buns with some homemade mayo over on my Lodge cast iron griddle. I had somebody ask me the other day what my favorite cast iron pieces were. I have to say it's kind of a tie for me. For the rest of you who might be curious, I love this double burner griddle because it flips from both sides. But then I have a huge 15-inch skillet, which you saw me using earlier when I was making that hash. Both of them are absolute workhorses for a large family. Of course, if your family is smaller, you might not need so much room, but definitely something that I would recommend if you're cooking for a crowd. Now, once those buns were toasted, I went ahead and pulled them off and then took orders. Some of the crew likes mayo on their buns, some wants barbecue, some want barbecue on the side and mayo on the bun. So when you have this many littles, it's kind of interesting to see what all the individual requests are. There's a couple who I always know automatically what they're going to want, but then a few others like to throw me some curveballs. Meanwhile, the kiddos were, as you can see, getting ready for the pool. That's my little one in her cutie little swimming suit. She also had a cottonelle box on her head. They emptied out some new toilet paper. I always tell everybody that the most fun my kids have is cardboard boxes. We can buy them awesome gifts, but when that thing gets pulled out, the box is going to be what they play with first. The toy will come later. So, keeping that in mind, I told them to get the boxes over to the recycling pile and get to the table so we could finish this meal and get off to the pool. As for side dishes, I typically love a classic potato salad. Using home canned potatoes is one of my favorite ways to go because it really makes the process of making a potato salad so short. But on this specific day, at the time when we have cucumbers rolling in for days, it's our quick refrigerator pickle cucumbers to save the day, as well as some hard boiled eggs. Now that we've knocked out what would be considered a pretty traditional leftover brisket meal, I want to turn that on its head and show you something that really was exciting for me to try. We are having a brisket linguini, with mushrooms, kale, and a beautiful sauce made from beef broth. Now, my husband deemed this amazing creation Hamburger Helper 2.0. Now, take what you will, but as kids growing up in the 90s, Hamburger Helper was something that wasn't necessarily uncommon around my house. I definitely had a favorite, which I still have fond memories of today, which is beef stroganoff. If you have a favorite hamburger helper, leave that down below. It'll just make me laugh to know I'm not alone. Growing up craving something so just simple, I guess you would call it, and straight off the shelf, which is something my kids really don't know much about today. Anyway, back to the meal. We're going in with some chopped onions. Once those are done, I'm going to get them over to a hot skillet so they can start to caramelize. Now, the depth of flavor that you're going to get from the onions is going to be really dependent on how long you let them cook. If you just let them go to a translucent, you're not going to have the same flavor as if you caramelize them, and that is something that my family really likes. So I did let these go a little bit further than what the recipe called for. Again, I will make sure that recipe is down below for you. I want you to try this one out and definitely give credit where credit is due because this was delicious. Once that was on the stove, I went ahead and washed the kale, and my helper was actually in the front room with my husband and some other kiddos. He had just got home and he brought a ton of stuff for them to try on that were samples from his work. So they were preoccupied, so she didn't even notice that I was doing the salad spinner without her. So I just gave it a quick pull and set it to the side to let it continue to spin while I chopped up the mushrooms, which were the next ingredients. Now, interesting about the mushrooms, I actually use mushroom compost from this specific farm that sells into Walmart in my local area on my garden, and everything grows so beautifully. Occasionally, I will get some mushrooms out there, but definitely didn't have enough for the recipe that I was making here. So I did stop and grab some while I was down getting my groceries at my Azure pickup this time. Now, after the onions had caramelized, I'm just throwing in all of the mushrooms into the pan. I do have water prepping on the back for my linguini noodles, which you'll see there. I turned it up really high and have some salt in there. So all things kind of working at the same time to make this come together. This pasta does not take long at all. So you'll want to make sure that you get that water started to begin with. And if you're throwing in some Italian bread like I am into the oven, make sure to preheat that when you get started as well, because the sauce is really rather fast. So you want to make sure those other elements that you can't rush are ready to go when your sauce is complete. Now I went ahead and pulled out those brisket slices that I had got sliced up earlier in the day, and I'm just going to chunk them up into small enough pieces that would be a good bite size. When I'm doing a pasta sauce, I want to make sure that people feel like they don't have to cut anything up. The noodles are enough of a challenge for the little ones, but they really love them long. So even against my better judgment, I don't crack them in half before I throw them in the pan. We just kind of deal with what comes of it. They always have fun. So it is what it is when we're at home. And I do my best to try to teach them the proper table manners to go along with it. Now, once the brisket is all cut up, it's time to head over and get it back into that pan so it can work in with the other ingredients. But before we add in the brisket, the kale needs to go in and get wilted. Now, this is really important because you don't want your kale to be crispy and that brisket is already cooked. So making sure to wilt that down is really important. Now, before I threw the linguine in, I went ahead and resalted the water. And like I mentioned before, I have that stove already preheated because it's time to throw that bread in. Everything will be done in under 10 minutes at this point. So once those noodles are cooked, that's actually the end of what we're waiting on to get this done. Now, I will go ahead and just note, make sure to reserve about a cup of your pasta water before you drain it. The reason is you'll need that to have your sauce come together in the end. And as you can see, my tiny little helper was all too anxious to come in and pull down the oven door for me. She is very careful. I was standing right behind the camera, and she does know to make sure to pull straight down and walk away, as you saw. Now, I know I always get a lot of people concerned with her in the kitchen and what she's up next to, but this little one has been on my chest or by my side in the kitchen for almost 3 straight years now. And while that is a short time, she's getting a lot of coaching and really is pretty safe. I went ahead and tossed the brisket into the pan, and there is one more ingredient that I'm going to go ahead and add here that's a little different than the recipe. I am adding a homemade beef bone broth to this recipe because the recipe itself called for a cup of drippings from the brisket, which I obviously don't have at this point because I'm just using what I had left over. Now, once that is in the pan and everything is coming together, I went ahead and grabbed those noodles off. Like I said, reserving that liquid before I got started, draining the noodles, and my little one here is begging for her portion. So I will go ahead and grab her one out, setting it on the cutting board so it can cool while I take the rest back over to the stove. Now, every time I show this cutting board and my colander setup, people ask for a link. I don't have one. This came with my sink. If I do ever find one, I'll make sure to link it down below because it is really awesome and super flexible. But currently, it only comes with the sink if you're purchasing a new sink, which is a Kraus workstation. Now, as you can see, with everything we have going on this week, tackling my idea to get back into baking bread was not what I had in mind on this specific day. So I just grabbed a crusty loaf when I was down at the grocery store picking up everything else that I needed for the day. Now, noodles are done. I'm going to throw that pasta sauce in and get everything really incorporated. There's one last ingredient that I'm going to go ahead and add, which is some freshly grated Parmesan cheese right to the top. I find that when I go out to an Italian restaurant, they always do that for me, and I love to have that same effect recreated in my own kitchen. Now, I have shown you 3 fun meals, but I wanted to just kind of get your mind going in other directions so you can see exactly how far this can go. Some other recipes that I really love with leftover brisket are rice bowls, chili, stew, tacos, nachos, quesadillas, chopped salads, shepherd's pie. Think grilled cheese and that stroganoff that I remember from my childhood, pizza, loaded fries, loaded baked potatoes, or even stuffed mushrooms. And one of our personal favorites with leftovers, which is a fried rice. Super simple and easy to eat and delicious at the same time. Hopefully something that I've shared with you today has sparked your curiosity or maybe even piqued your interest into cooking up some large cuts of meat in your kitchen at home. From my family to yours, I thank you today and every day for stopping by my kitchen, and I hope to see you back again next week.